Good evening, everyone. So nice to see so many people here. I am thrilled this evening to be able to introduce not only a wonderful rabbi, but a good friend of mine. And so I'm so happy that she's able to teach these classes for us. So Rabbi Annette Koch entered rabbinical school after 18 years as an attorney in New York, and she specialized in asset-based finance and international commercial finance. At dinner one night, a rabbinical intern from the temple she belonged to suggested she become a rabbi. After initially dismissing the idea, she came to realize that was the right move. Ordained in 2006, she worked for 3 years at a suburban Portland congregation in Lake Oswego, Oregon, followed by a stint at a synagogue in the Philadelphia suburbs. Then Rabbi Koch focused on work as a chaplain at a hospital and a hospice before serving Temple Israel in Alameda, California, where she also served as a soloist. And she's been gone from there for a while and is doing a number of part-time jobs in San Jose and up near where she lives in Alameda. And luckily is free to offer some wonderful classes for us. So Rabbi Koch is going to offer us some very good learning. And then at the end of it, we'll reserve it for questions. But if you have burning questions along the way, please feel free to raise your hand, either with the symbols that we have on Zoom or, with your own actual hand. Rabbi Koch.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here. It's always fun to teach and to learn together. And every time I go through this material, I learn something new. So, and because we have 90 minutes all together, I'm going to just plow ahead because there's way more than 90 minutes worth of stuff here. So I'm going to have to talk really fast, which is easy for me because I'm from New York originally. And feel free to ask questions, raise your hand, whatever, and we'll schmooze. So
let me just add, by the way, one quick thing. Thank you to the Legacy Fund for making this possible.
Thank you so much. So this program is a 3-part program. I have taught this in as many as 6 sections. So getting it down to 3 wasn't easy. I had to wrestle with it. But this is part 1. And this is kind of a little bit of history, a little bit of this, a little bit of that. So my first, let's see. So part 1 is going to be beginnings. It's called A New Civilization Arises Out of the Dark Ages. And we're going to go through to the modern period, which is from approximately 1000 of the Common Era to 1750. We're going to travel light and travel fast. Part 2, which will be next week, is the modern period from 750 to the present in poetry, story, and song. And part 3 is the modern period in multiple media, the press, radio, cinema, and the internet. So my question to you is, what do you think of when you hear the word Yiddish? Feel free to unmute yourself and, you can answer. What's going on here with my... Let's see. I think I got a lot.
Okay, Christine has her hand up. So why don't you go ahead, Christine?
Christine, what do you think of when you think of the word Yiddish?
I think of some very refined ways of parsing human personalities and foibles. No country does, no language does it better.
Okay.
Really, it's like intimate knowledge of other people, which I think comes out of shtetl existence.
All right.
Working together, and it's too intimate, but you get to know foibles extremely well, and they're often extremely funny.
Yes.
I think it gets you through.
Yeah. Any other things you think of when you think of the word Yiddish?
Joan? You're muted, Joan. You have to unmute.
I think of my grandma.
You think of your grandma.
Carolee?
I think of my grandparents and my parents when they didn't want me to understand anything.
Okay. So I have some images that might help with suggestions. Are these some of the things that you think of when you think of the word Yiddish? When you think of Yiddish, do you think of the old shtetl in Russia, the Fiddler on the Roof,
Lower East Side.
the Holocaust, right? Where the Yiddish speaking world was decimated. Or in modern times, the ultra Orthodox communities where Yiddish is still the vernacular.
Crown Heights.
And it's a kind of a different Yiddish than we grew up hearing our parents and our grandparents speak.
Both of them.
Or do you think of this?
Oh,
So that was the Alibi Sisters. They are two sisters from Ukraine, where a lot of Yiddish speaking has happened. This was before the war started in last February at the Voice Ukraine, which is a kind of a talent competition show where they got what's called a 4-chair turn singing Chiri Biri Bum in Yiddish. And I did not send you the Yiddish lyrics or the translation, but it just shows us that the culture and the language and the civilization behind it are still very relevant and still going on and still being heard in a really exciting and beautiful way. When we think of Yiddish, what do we think of? We think of Yiddish as a language primarily, right?
Yes.
The evolution of the Yiddish language reflects the history of the Jewish people. It's baked into the language itself. Now, some people say that Yiddish is more than just a language, that it's the people themselves. Yiddish-speaking people have used it to manage every aspect of everyday life. It was the vernacular of millions of people for centuries. Universally spoken by the Jews across Western, Central, and Eastern Europe. More than that, though, it also became a sacred language. It was the language used for prayer and for Torah study and for commentary. In Hebrew, we call it Lashon Kodesh. In Yiddish, it's Lashon Kodesh. And it's also art because it's poetry, it's short story, it's folk tales, drama, music, theater, cinema. And today, it's even used on the internet. Some say it's a whole civilization. So first of all, it's a language reflecting the history of the Yiddish-speaking people and of the Jews. Its roots are in Middle High German. I'm going to try to go really fast through some of this, but it's absorbed vocabulary. And if you look at the list, it's got Aramaic, Hebrew, Latin, Why Latin? Because its original speakers came from the Latin-speaking countries. I've got a map I'll show you in a minute. And they were speaking vulgar Latin. Vulgar not because they were cursing, but because it was no longer classic Latin. It was a much later Latin, and it was a Latin spoken by the people. But it also has Turkish and French and Greek and Hungarian and a whole bunch of Slavic languages mixed in. And we'll see in a minute the answer to how did all of this stuff get there? How did all of this stuff accrue to this language we call Yiddish? So we're not going to spend any time on this, but this is one way of picturing the timeline of Jewish history. From 35 before the Common Era to 2000 of the Common Era. The parts we're really going to focus on are in this box right here. I actually had a version of this slide that had this outline. Don't know how this one got in here, but so from about the year 1000 to here. And we'll hear in a second how we got to the year 1000 through migration. Some of the stages of Jewish migration. I'm not really planning on starting with the Garden of Eden, but it gives you an idea, right? Abraham takes a journey. All of our ancestors take journeys. In 720 before the Common Era, however, right, we have Moses leading the people in down to Egypt and back. In 720 before the Common Era, however, we have our first major historic dispossession when the Assyrian Empire conquers, and it's a different kind of dispossession than any of the others we will suffer further on. The next big one is in 586 before the Common Era, when the Babylonian Empire conquered Israel. First temple is destroyed, and people are displaced. But unlike the Assyrian Empire, there are people who are not displaced. There are people who stay in Palestine, and the people who are displaced to Babylon, they don't lose their sense of identity as Jews, as Israelites, as Hebrew speakers. That's 586 before the Common Era. 538, the Persian Empire says, we've conquered Babylon, everyone go home. Everyone goes home. And home is the lands of Palestine. 370, the Greeks led by Alexander the Great conquer Palestine. More stages, the Maccabean revolt, they get the land back, but they haven't gone anywhere. 163 before the Common Era, Israel is conquered by the Hellenized Syrians. Another conquest. Each of these conquests leads to some diaspora, but these early conquests don't really create big diasporas. In 63 BCE, the most important one happens really, which is the conquest of the Palestinian lands by Rome. Rome changes the face of the planet, really, for everybody. That's 63 BCE. For about 100 years, the Israelites managed to stay quiet, but they just couldn't take it anymore. And in 66, they revolt against Rome. And Rome had one rule: stay quiet, pay your taxes, we'll leave you alone and let you do what you want. But they couldn't. So in 66, the Second Temple is destroyed. Israelites are massacred, many flee. But they flee to other parts of what we call Israel now. And we have the Bar Kokhba revolt. Over 500,000 Jews are slaughtered. A lot of this material you can see is in the Jewish Virtual Library. I've put citations here. I will put them together by the end of the third program, and I can hand those out. This starts a kind of persecution that's different from anything else that's happened, and survivors flee. But they're now not just fleeing to other parts of Israel, they're fleeing to Babylonia. Why? Because not everybody came home. Jeremiah had told people, plant your gardens, get married, have children. We don't know when redemption will come. And when Cyrus said, go home, people said, wait a minute, I planted a garden, I got married, I had children, I'm not going anywhere. The fact that there is now a thriving Jewish community in Babylonia is very important, because it gives rise to some of the great thinkers and writers of the great academies of Babylonia, especially when we get a little bit past here. So here is a little map, but I want to talk about Rome's changing the face of the planet. Rome created something called the Pax Romana. They kept things quiet. They created roads that were safe to travel, so merchants and trade could happen. And they let people alone. In essence, during this whole period of Roman hegemony, anyone could worship anybody they wanted. Paid taxes, kept quiet. The Pax Romana was essential to distributing people and goods and ideas all through this area. And we're not just looking at the Italian peninsula. We're looking at Macedonia. We're looking all the way over to Mesopotamia where the academies were. Northern Africa, up into Spain. This area, Aquitania, that's going to be France. That's going to be, parts of this are France. And out here, there's going to be Germany, the British Isles. It's an enormous amount of territory. The Israelites are still staying in Palestine, kind of, sort of, right? They were granted full Roman citizenship by a horrible, bloodthirsty emperor named Caracalla in the 3rd century of the Common Era. Tragedy happens when Rome converts to Christianity. That's when tragedy really happens for the Jews. The Emperor Constantine converts, changes the capital to Constantinople in Turkey. When Christianity becomes a state religion, the status of the Jews in Rome begins to deteriorate. Now, they had been traveling everywhere anyway, but now things are even more difficult for them at home. The second big tragedy during this period, in 410, the Goths finally sack Rome, and what's left of the Pax Romana dies. The roads are no longer safe. Travel in this whole area is no longer safe to do. But it's not safe to stay in this Christian empire either. Some Israelites, they head east, Byzantium, what we used to call Babylonia. And Babylonian Jewish communities are thriving. Some of them are still traveling all through this area, looking for a way to make a living, basically. We're moving along our timeline. What happens next? 650, Muhammad has a conversion, becomes the major prophet of Islam. And not very long later, in 711, this area, Muslim Spain, conquered by the Islamic armies. What's beginning here now is because Spain is conquered by the Muslims, there are Jewish communities forming in Spain. And in fact, the Jews allied with the Muslims in Spain against the Christians, and didn't do too badly in Spain. They lived not too badly. Once again, when Spain Christianizes, that picture changes. But because this is Muslim Spain, and there are more Muslims out here, traveling back and forth isn't as difficult anymore. When travel opens up, things begin to blossom. We're in 800 of the Common Era. And we have a little area here. It says Holy Roman Empire, finally pulled together by a great king. He said to himself, he named himself Charlemagne, Charles the Great. And he does something very interesting. They are now in a feudal system. We are in the height of the Dark Ages. And it's really dark. The church is hoarding knowledge. It's hoarding literacy. And people are locked into a system they can't get out of. They can't travel. They're bound to the land. Who can travel? Who can read? Who can write? And who has access to peoples from other parts of the world, the Jews. Charlemagne invites Jews to come as traders and merchants and moneylenders, doing things outside the feudal system because no one in this feudal system can. The persecution of the Jews, however, continues. There is a real tension between wanting Jews there because they're outside the feudal system and not wanting them there because they're outside the feudal system, because they are outside the Christian feudal world. This tension continues, and in the year 1000, the Bishop of Rudiger of Speyer, which is up in here, invites Jews to settle in Speyer. It's in 1084. When Jews get to this area, this Holy Roman Empire area, they are now in what will ultimately become Germany. They've been in Spain. There are Jews in the area that will ultimately become France, but they start to really settle and take hold in this part of the world. The part of the world that's between Germany on the, Germany, which is between the Western states and these Eastern states of Eastern Europe. And they're in here. They're still speaking basically Latin, a kind of, the common Latin, the vulgar Latin it's called. But they're living in and amongst these old German speakers. And I don't mean that the speakers were old, the language was old German. And they start picking up the language of the communities they're living in. But German and Old German becomes the root, the heart, the kind of basis for the language that the Jewish communities will speak. The next catastrophe. The next catastrophe is because we know the feudal system locked everyone in, but it was a problem because there were people, there weren't enough roles, there wasn't enough money, there wasn't enough, basically jobs for the royalty of the feudal system. And all of these little areas are duchies and small kingdoms and tiny kingdoms, and they're fighting with each other. Charlemagne is gone. Descendants of Charlemagne are trying to hold it together, and they come up with a brilliant idea. They're going to send them all off to war. They're going to send them off to war to conquer the Holy Land. And in 1096, the first armies of the Crusades get going. I promise we'll get much more interesting as soon as I finish this basic part of history. But they start the Crusades. But what happens on the way from here all the way to down here behind where all the faces are? They pass a lot of Jewish communities, a lot of infidels on their way to take the Holy Land back from the infidels. So what do? They attack the Jewish communities on the way. And the difference here, once again, this is a big change because this is now state-sponsored terrorism against the Jewish communities, and it normalizes violence against Jewish communities. That's something we still live with. So just a kind of summary, what keeps the Jews going? Enterprise, exclusion, and expulsion. Enterprise. They're invited by rulers and leaders to come and bring skills missing from the feudal system. Exclusion. The church hoarded the necessary skills like writing and arithmetic. Only the clergy were allowed to learn to read and write. Ordinary people during the Dark Ages were not. Excluded from their learning system, they created and made their own. Now, because writing in Roman letters was hoarded by the church, it was a sacred Christian act, according to the Jews. They didn't want to do anything the Christians did. So they didn't write in Roman letters, but they all knew some Hebrew letters. They knew the Hebrew alphabet, right? So they spoke this vulgar Latin that now was getting mixed up with a lot of the Germanic language, Old German, and they wrote their language in Hebrew letters. They did all of their writing using the Hebrew alphabet. Enterprise, exclusion, expulsion, continuously expelled over and over and over. 1072 from Mainz, 1290 from England, 1395 from France, 1405. Remember when the Bishop of Speyer invited them to come and settle there? He built them a town called New Speyer. 1405, they're expelled. 1492, the Christians finally conquer the Spanish peninsula. They kick out the Muslims, and with the Muslims, they kick out the Jews. Where do they go? They go east. Let's see where they go. Oops. If we go back to our little map, right, they're in here. They can't go west. They've been expelled from all the Western countries, so they start going east. What's east? Bohemia, which is another part of the Germanic areas, Poland, Hungary, Croatia, Serbia, down here, Romania, and this area, Ukraine. They go east. Now, I do want to say that these are migrations. They may be expelled, but it's not ethnic cleansing. Survivors remained, and not everybody left. It's Jeremiah all over again, just like in Babylon. A lot of people left, some people stayed. Many people died, others survived. Somehow, Jewish communities kept their roots where they were, others started moving east and thrived. So, what is Yiddish? That is a history of the Jewish people overall. But what is Yiddish? Yiddish is a language. It's the language that evolves from these migrations, which is why we see all those words from different languages. And what you have on here is, I found an image of it, but I actually have a paper copy of this in my desk drawer. And it is the Yiddish alphabet. And it's the one I learned to read and write Yiddish with when I was a little kid going to Abedring Schule. So, and I have my slide here in script for those of you who can read it. And it says, Yiddish is a Sprach. Yiddish is a language. It's a written language using Hebrew letters, except you see all this stuff down here? That's not in the Hebrew alphabet because there are sounds that aren't made in Hebrew. And so they used very clever combinations of letters to make those sounds. You have a zh and a ch. You have oi. And vowels are not the way we see them in Hebrew under the letters. None of these letters will take vowels under them. An aleph is one of the few that does because it's either an a or an o, right? Where's your segol? Where's your eh? It's an ayin. Double yuds. Double yuds. If it's double yud like that, it's either going to be ye, or it's going to be yay, or it's going to be ya. So it's using the Hebrew alphabet, but a little bit differently. So the stages of development of Europe, of Yiddish, very early Yiddish, Rhine Valley, 950 to 1250. There are very few. I'm going to show you a different version of this. This is out of the Encyclopedia Judaica. Early Yiddish before 1250. No written documents, really. Old Yiddish, spreading east now. European expansion, Jewish colonization, various historic things. 1272, the earliest Yiddish text. So we're 13th century before we get to the earliest Yiddish text. And 1382, the oldest literary documents in Yiddish, found in the Cairo Geniza, which is fascinating to me. Middle Yiddish, this is where we're going to begin. the period from 1500 to 1750, Middle Yiddish. And that's what we're going to look at today. Now, remember, the Gutenberg press was invented in 1464, I think. In 1517, a full set of the Talmud was already in print. 1534, first printed books in Yiddish. And a book called Tzenu Urena, which is a commentary on the Torah in Yiddish, ostensibly created for women, but so many men were illiterate, it was really for anyone who couldn't read Hebrew. I don't have an example of Tzenu Urena. It's incredibly expensive and hard to find now, but it's still used. So now we move. One more look at the map. This is what Krivacek, the writer of one of the books I'm relying on for a lot of our information, called Yiddish Civilization, calls the Yiddish lands. Now, I tried to figure out how to do an overlay of his picture of the Yiddish lands with this map of Europe in 1025. And it's kind of hard to picture, but you can see here, this is all of this. It goes to the border of France, which is out here. Here's Muslim Spain. By 1500, it's all Christian. And Jews are settling not just out here. They've been expelled from all these countries. They're moving east. And they're still in contact with communities in the Byzantine Empire. I won't go into the story, the legend of the four captives, because it doesn't really address the issue of Yiddish. The legend of the four captives was four rabbis who left Babylonia to go collect money for the great academies in Babylonia, and they got caught by pirates and ransomed off to different communities who paid big ransoms for them so they could have scholars start learning in their own towns. But that was really North Africa and further east. So what have we got here? We've got our alphabet again. Why? Because a language needs to be written down to be a literature. But we're in really early stages. What kind of literature is there? The earliest known Yiddish literature written in Judeo-German, which is why I do not have a dual language copy of this. It was translated into Yiddish in the 20th century. So Judeo-German is very hard to read, but it is in English. And it was written by a woman named Gluckel of Hamelin. And I have a few bits and pieces from Gluckel. She was born in 1646 in Hamburg. So we're still in this Holy Roman Empire Germanic area. Her family was very wealthy. Nevertheless, money cannot protect you from these expulsions. These expulsions which create the Jewish diaspora, which creates Jewish civilization. Interestingly enough, this is one of her descendants many generations later who dressed up and posed for this picture in clothes Gluckel might have worn in the 17th century. And we have an idea of what she might have looked like. Her father made sure all of his children were taught to read and write and got secular and religious education. Betrothed at 12 and married at 14. She had 14 children with her husband, Chaim, who she raves about in her memoirs, and he died in 1689. She took over his business, traveled all over, married off all her children with dowries. And her one fear, and you tell me if any of you can relate to this, was that she never wanted to have to depend on her children. She wanted to maintain her independence, live independently, and she didn't ever want to have to rely on them or depend on them. Unfortunately, her second husband lost his fortune and died, and she wound up living with one of her children who she says treated her with the utmost respect. So she wrote this in 7 chapters after her husband died, and this is her introduction. So if you guys want to unmute yourselves, I can stop talking for a little while, and somebody could read the paragraph I have marked with the yellow highlighter.
Who would like to read?
Do you have any takers for reading?
Okay, Christine. Go ahead.
Christine.
This, dear children, will be no book of morals. Such I could not write, and our sages have already written many. Moreover, we have our holy Torah, in which we may find and learn all that we need for our journey through this world to the world to come. It is like a rope which the great and gracious God has thrown to us as we drown in the stormy sea of life, that we may seize hold of it and be saved. The kernel of the Torah is, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. But in our days, we seldom find it so, and few are they who love their fellow. I don't know how to do this.
I got it. I got it.
Ah, it's too small for my eyes. Okay, there we go. With all their hearts. On the contrary, if a man can contrive to ruin his neighbor, nothing pleases him more.
So I'm going to stop you there, Christine,
Okay,
for
sure.
a second. Anybody else want to read the next paragraph? Does anybody remember what she said?
Lori. Okay.
Okay, Lori, thank you, because I can't get all the people up on the screen at the same time. So, Lori?
The best thing for you, my children, is to serve God from your heart without falsehood or sham, not giving out to people that you are one thing while God forbid in your heart you are another. Say your prayers with awe and devotion. During this time for prayers, do not stand about and talk of other things. While prayers are being offered to the Creator of the world, hold it a great sin to engage another man in talk about an entirely different matter. Shall Almighty God be kept waiting until you have finished your business?
All right, let's stop there. So what did she say this book was not going to be?
A book of morals.
And what is it?
A book of
Of
morals.
morals.
Now, there's a really interesting little parable that she shares with us, and I think it would be nice to read it. Do we have another volunteer for reading? Carolee. It starts on the screen where it says the bird.
Bird.
A bird. Is that where you want me to start?
Mhm, mhm.
A bird once set out to cross a windy sea with its 3 fledglings. The sea was so wide and the wind so strong, the father bird was forced to carry his young one by one in his strong claws. When he was halfway across with the first fledgling, the wind turned to a gale and he said, "My child, look how I am struggling and risking my life in your behalf. And when you are grown up, will you do as much for me and provide for my old age?" The fledgling replied, "Only bring me to safety, and when you are old, I shall do everything you ask of me." It must be whereas. Whereas
No,
the
it's
father,
whereat.
okay.
Whereat.
Whereat the father bird dropped his child into the sea, and it drowned. And he
Nice.
said, "So shall it be done to such a liar as you." Then the father bird returned to shore, set forth with his second fledgling, and asked the same question, and receiving,
Ask the same
I
question.
can't, wait a minute. Whoops, it's not
Right
going
here.
off. It's
You're
not going off.
receiving the same answer.
Same
Oh, there, I got it. Okay, and receiving the same answer, drowned the second child with the cry, "You too are a liar." Finally, he set out with the third fledgling, and when he asked the same question, the third and last fledgling replied, "My dear father, it is true you are struggling mightily and risking your life on my behalf, and I shall be wrong not to repay you when you are old, but I cannot bind myself. This, though, I can promise. When I am grown up and have children of my own, I shall do as much for them as you have done for me." Thereupon the father bird said, "Well spoken, my child, and wisely. Your life I will spare, and I will carry you to shore in safety.
So what do you guys make of this story
Wow.
that she puts right in the beginning of her non-moralizing story, right?
Don't lie to your
Don't
father.
lie.
Or don't promise something that you can't know that you're going to fulfill,
Well, don't do it when you're in peril.
especially when you're in peril.
Now, she could have just said those things, right?
Of course.
Uh-huh.
But she chose this really engaging little story that kind of had us all going, what? Killed the kid? Are you kidding me? So yeah, she's a very clever writer. And I mean, she wrote this book in 1690, from 1690 to 1691. And first of all, I don't know that we expected women to be that well educated in that time. And also that she's just a very engaging writer. Now, there's one more story. There are many, many wonderful stories, but I'm cognizant of the time. So and there are other things I want us to do, but there's one more really adorable story, and I had marked this. Okay. So remember that she was betrothed at 12. And here again, I had marked this piece here where she says, I'm not going to preach to you, but, and then she starts to preach, and we're not going to look at that. This is actually the beginning of book 1, and she talks about her birth and coming into the world, and then that she is, married at 14, and another year or so later, first they live with his family, and then they move in to live with her family in Hamburg. And it starts here where it says part 4. It's not book 4, it's part 4 of book 1. And do we have another volunteer for reading?
Can you make it bigger though?
Yeah, I can do my best to make it a little bit bigger.
Thanks. Who's
Okay.
volunteering to read?
I'll read. Where do we
Thank you.
start?
Let's start with immediately on our arrival in Hamburg. I will turn the pages.
Immediately on our arrival in Hamburg, I became with child, and my mother along with me. In good time, the Lord graciously delivered me of a young daughter. I was still a mere girl, and unused as I was to bury children, it naturally went hard with me. Yet I rejoiced mightily that the Most High had bestowed on me a healthy, lovely baby.
So she's maybe 15 years old here.
Huh.
So let's read this next paragraph.
This here,
Mhm.
my
But you need to make
My
it
dear
bigger.
good mother.
Need to make it bigger.
Need to make it bigger.
Oh,
It's really
right.
small.
How's
better.
that?
Oh, that's good.
this one, I went
Yeah.
My dear good mother.
Oh, my dear good mother had reckoned out her time for the same day. However, she had a great joy in my being brought to bed first so she could help me a little. Young girl that I was. 8 days later, my mother likewise brought forth a young daughter in childbirth. So there was neither envy nor reproach between us, and we lay next to each other in the same room. But Lord, we had no peace, for the people that came running in to see the marvel, a mother and a daughter together in childbed.
So imagine she's, her mother, she's just given birth, her mother's just given birth. They're both laying together in the nursery room, and people are coming in to go,
Yeah.
Even then, this kind of struck people as a little bit odd. But she's fine with it, absolutely fine with it. The room has gotten very crowded, however, and so in this next section here, she decides to go back to sleeping in her own bedroom with her husband, And she leaves the baby in the common room where it slept with a maid near it. And her mother reassured her not to worry, that if the child cried, the maid would bring it to her so that she could nurse it and bring it back and put it in its cradle. And she was fine with that. And so here where it says, I went over to the cradle, is anybody willing to read?
I'll continue. I went over to the cradle and I found it empty. It was sorely frightened, yet I did not want to scream for fear of arousing my mother. So I began to shake the maid in the hope of waking her quietly. But she lay in a deep sleep, and I had to begin screaming aloud before she could break off her slumber. Where have you put my child? I cried. Whereat she began talking half in her sleep, not knowing what she said. At this, my mother awoke and said to the maid, where have you put my Glückchen baby? But the maid proved too sleepy to reply.
All right, so let's see if we can get one more person to participate. Can we get another reader? I can't see everybody.
Sure, I'll give it a try.
Great.
Oh,
Alan.
thank you. So I said to my mother.
Said to my mother, I said, perhaps you have my baby in bed with you. No, no, she said, I have my baby in bed with me. And she stuck to it as though someone wanted to make off with her baby. Then it occurred to me to look for her child in its own cradle, and there it lay, soft asleep. So I said, Mother, give me now my baby. Yours lies in its cradle. But she refused to believe me, and I had to fetch a light so she could examine it carefully. Finally, I was able to make her accept her own baby and bring away mine. By this time, the whole house was aroused and everyone badly alarmed. However, fright soon vanished in laughter, and the word went round. A little more, and we'd had to summon the blessed King Solomon himself.
So what do you guys make of this story? Any reactions? Any responses to the story itself or how she's written it? The images that she uses?
That there are complications when two women have babies at the same time in the same place.
In the same house, right?
In the
And they
same
kind of
house,
look alike because they're mother and daughter.
right?
And that little comment she makes at the end of the story about Solomon, anybody know what she's talking about here?
Sure.
Yeah, deciding who's the mother of the baby.
Right,
It's not cutting the baby in half. The real mother's going to speak up.
right. And that story is not in Torah. Actually it is.
Yes,
It's in Tanakh. The story of Solomon and the
Yeah.
two, I think that's in Tanakh. That's not Midrash.
right.
So she's really an incredibly well-educated person. And she writes this beautifully. The reason that the translator uses all of these old kind of English words of where at and things like that is that because it was written in what's called Judeo-German or Yiddish Deutsch. It's not really Yiddish yet.
Yeah.
And the translator wanted to sort of convey a taste of what this language was like. So that is Gluckel of Hamlin.
Hey, I have a question.
Sure.
Was she unusual in being able to read and write at that time, or
Absolutely.
was that common in that time?
I think that she was an unusual human being to begin with, but I think the fact that women were literate was probably not all that unique. They were very involved in business. Even back then, women, although Gluckel's husband was a diamond trader, and just as her father had been, women often were in business. literacy was still not that common, but it was not uncommon for women to be able to read and write. Remember that lots of literature was being written in Yiddish specifically for women and for some of the men who couldn't really read Hebrew. So, and we'll see more of that in the next set of texts that we have, which are called tachinas. So you remember that I had said, and I'm going to go back to our PowerPoint. Any more questions about Gluckel or impressions about Gluckel?
Yeah, I have a question. You keep mentioning that she was married at 14. Wasn't that normal then to be married at 14?
Yes,
That's normal. Okay.
it was absolutely normal.
Well, you also didn't live very long if you had children, one after the other.
She did have 14 children.
Yeah, exactly.
And
If you have one every other year,
pretty
you're
much.
worn out by the time you're 40.
What's interesting is that she lived till she was 78. And one of the things that the scholars teach us about the Middle Ages and the Renaissance period is that although life was, as Thomas Hobbes, the great philosopher of the 19th century, said life was in those days nasty, brutal, and short, the reality was it was short on average. If you didn't die in childhood,
That's it.
in the 17th century, you had a good chance of living well into your 70s. And so it wasn't uncommon for people. It wasn't unknown, certainly, and I don't think it was uncommon for people to live a long life. Shakespeare wrote, the 7 ages of man, and includes the very old age of tottering around, because it was well known. And yes, it was very common for girls to be betrothed at 12 and married off at 14. And there are communities that still do that. So any other questions or?
Yeah, I have a question. Was literacy in women, aside from being a class marker, which it seems to be, but who has businesses, and they're family businesses basically, and so it's advantageous for people to be literate. But I'm assuming it's also a class marker, and would that have been seen as something which would be part of a dowry, if you will, that would make her more desirable as a potential marriage partner, is that she was literate?
I think that the answer to your question, and I'm not a sociologist who studied the sociology of the era, but I believe that the answer to your first question is probably no, and your second question is probably yes. So dowry was money and goods.
Okay.
But literacy probably did make her a more desirable partner, and therefore able to marry somebody with a more promising young man, whether that was because he was studying in the yeshivas. Remember, Rashi was 11th and 12th century and had yeshivas go back several hundred years before Gluckel's even writing.
Right.
So, and studying in the yeshivas and sending the most promising young men from these towns off to the great yeshivas of France and of Germany was common. So she could snag herself the son of a rabbi, or perhaps the son of a merchant who was doing very well. So I like the way you said it, a class marker. Although we'll see that we're now in the late 17th, approaching the early 18th century, and literacy among women becomes much more common, which is why we have our tachinas.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions? And by the way, this is the only part of our 3-part program where I'll spend as much time on history, but it's kind of important to see this ebb and flow of human life. And interestingly enough, when the Jews were expelled from certain places a couple hundred years later, they're invited back and they go. So it's this real ebb and flow of Jewish community.
I have a question about that. I'm assuming, maybe wrongly, that the reason they're invited back isn't so much all of the skills that they bring back, but that the rulers of those duchies and so on and so forth were constantly borrowing money. And if you borrowed it from the Jews, if that came due and you couldn't pay it off, you could expel them. And it would be harder to do that with somebody who was already part of the duchy.
Well, I don't know the answer to your question, and it doesn't sound unreasonable, but remember that if you get a reputation for not paying your debts,
Well,
you're gonna need to borrow from somebody.
well, the king and queen of Spain certainly had a bad rep.
What?
The king and queen of Spain certainly had a bad rep.
Yeah, yeah. But if instead of paying your debts, you kept expelling people, who were you going to borrow money from?
Yeah.
And there are writings, and Kruvacek actually has texts in his book about people complaining about the interest rates. Because remember that Torah prohibits us from charging usury,
Right.
which the Christians took very seriously and didn't charge interest at all.
Yeah.
And the Jews didn't charge interest to each other, but to non-Jews they could.
Outsiders. Yes.
And so there were great complaints about the interest rates and the fact that you would pay off one debt and the next loan, the interest rate was higher. You'd pay it off and the next one was higher. So I think people did mostly pay their debts if they had an expectation that they needed to borrow again.
And the Rothschilds weren't around yet.
Well, they actually come into the picture pretty soon.
Yeah.
Because remember, we're approaching the 18th century here. She's
France.
writing in 1690. She dies in 1712. So Gluckel is really a bridge between the 17th and the 18th century. And the Rothschilds actually do come around. And there's a picture of one of the Rothschilds in the Kruvacek book that I did not include in the PowerPoint. So I will go back to the PowerPoint, which is where, oh, it's here. That was the cover of the printed version of Gluckel's book. And so here we are again at our map, just to get a better idea. Once again, these are the British lands. And I kind of tried to outline on this map of 16th century Europe what this would look like. So it's this area here, it's Russia and Crimea, and the Crimean Khanate, Moldova, Hungary, down here, Romania. These are all the German fiefdoms, Poland and Lithuania, Estonia. And along here, I kind of cut into France because the Jewish communities crossed the border. The borders weren't that clear, and they did cross the border. Not too many Jews in Italy. Spain is now fully Christianized. The Jews have been expelled. Jews have been expelled from England. And we're talking, so if you look at this as the Yiddish country, it kind of looks like that on the map. So we're back to our Aleph Bet. Yiddish is.
I have a question.
Yeah, please.
There were Jews in throughout this period in Venice.
Yes.
Because the trade, whether or not you were Jewish, there certainly was a lot of money going back and forth for trade, and that the Judeca, which was the Jewish quarter, was not a roped off quarter. I mean, it was primarily a neighborhood, but they were never expelled. And in fact,
right.
When the Nazis took over that area, they weren't expelled.
That's right. But it wasn't part of the area that was settled by Yiddish speaking Jews.
Right, exactly.
So they were probably
That's right.
still speaking.
They were Latinate, they were.
Right, they were Latinate. Which is why they're not included in this area of what Kravacha calls the Yiddish lands. But not only were there Jews living in Italy, right? They had been expelled from Spain, but they're now living in this whole area of the Ottoman Empire in Turkey, right? And if you go further east, they're living in the lands that were ancient Babylonia.
Yeah.
So which is probably part of the Ottoman Empire also. So they're everywhere. But what I've tried to mark off here are the areas where people are speaking this evolving language that starts as a sort of Germanic language, a combination of Germanic and vulgar Latin, and evolves into what we now know as Yiddish. But thank you for that. So here we go. So Yiddish is a literatur, right? It's a literature. And it's a language, but what kind of language is it? We call it Mama Lashon, right? The mother tongue. Lashon is language or tongue, right? But it's also Lashon Kodesh, a holy tongue. What makes it holy? It's holy depending on what you use it for, right? It's used for prayer. Torah was translated into Yiddish through Tzenorena, which was really more telling of stories in Midrash. But the prayer book, there was a Machzor, I think in the early 16th century, there was already a Yiddish translation of the Machzor, which is the High Holy Day prayer book. And then there are these books of what's called Techinas. It's from the word Techinot, which means supplication. If you've ever davened, which is the Yiddish word for praying, out of a traditional prayer book. In the daily prayers, morning and evening, there's something called tachanun. Same root, same word. It means supplication. Supplication and confession. Private devotional prayers, primarily for women, but as I said, also for basically illiterate men, for prayer and worship. In fact, there's one that's written specifically for the businessman who is praying to succeed in business. They were written both by men and women. Now, this cover here, The Merit of Our Mothers, I have a copy of it. It's a bilingual edition of Techinas, and we're going to look at some in a minute. Doesn't tell us which ones are written by which. There's a wonderful book called Seder Techinas by Deborah Kay, who does distinguish between the Techinas that are written by men and the Techinas that are written by women. They were very popular. And as soon as printing got a little bit cheaper, they were printed really cheaply, widely distributed for several hundred years. So what does a Techina look like? Oh, characteristics of early history of Techinas. They may have gone back as early as the 9th century. Manuscript editions were known. Remember, we don't get printing until the middle of the 15th century. But the first Seder Techinas was published anonymously in 1648 in Prague. Eastern Europe. We are now really in Eastern Europe. 1648, it's an interesting time. It's a time of Messianic Judaism. Shabtai Tzvi is only one of several people who thought they were the Messiah or somehow were bringing the Messiah. At the same time that this Messianic and kind of uber spiritual Judaism is trying to happen, we are also seeing massacres in Eastern Europe, right? The Cossack pogroms, the Chmelnytsky massacres in Poland and Ukraine, 100,000 Jews massacred in 2 years. Now, the Jews are fleeing Eastern Europe. Where are they going? They can't go further east. They're going back. They're going back to Central Europe and sometimes even the eastern parts of Western Europe. Amsterdam, Prague. 1762, a comprehensive collection of the Techinas is published. Another thing to remember about these as we go to look at them. We are now talking about the middle of the 18th century. What's going on in Western Europe in the 18th century? John Donne, Milton, Congreve, right? The voice is very different. While Donne and Milton are writing from an individual place, the Techinas are really written and published anonymously, and they give voice to the yearnings of the community rather than the individual. They were prayers for the everyday lives of people. We're going to take a look at a couple of them. Not just the everyday lives of people, but the specific mitzvot for women. I think Maimonides counted and gave us the official number of 613 mitzvot, commandments in the Torah. The number of bones in the body, 268 negative commandments, 365 positive commandments, fewer negative commandments because they're harder to do. Women get 3. They get challah, which is that little pinch of challah you throw in the oven when you're baking your challah for Shabbat, as was done in the temple of ancient times, nidah, which are the laws of female purity, and hadlakat nerot, the mitzvah of lighting candles. But there are techinas for all sorts of things. And remember, this is a messianic period of time. They are also praying for redemption. We're not going to look at those techinas. They are, here are some of them are attributed, some of them are not. Let's look at a techina. Here's a techina for lighting candles. They come with instructions, right? You are told how to do this because people are concerned. The writers are concerned that people don't know how to pray. Women don't go to shul. They're not taught in cheder about prayer. So the techinas were also a way of instructing women on how to pray. It says in Yiddish, dus zukt sie. This is what she says. Wenn sie tut lichten zinden Shabbos und Yom Tov und mit in the Yiddish pronunciation is kavune, with kavana. This is what she is to say when she's lighting candles for Shabbat and for Yom Tov, and she should say it with great intention. Would someone like to read the English?
Can you also make it bigger, please?
Okay. No, actually, I can't make this one bigger.
I will.
Oh, that's as big as I can get it on my screen because this is not in it's not in Adobe. This is
Right.
actually a slide. So on my screen, it's huge. I'm sorry.
Hey, Lori's going to read it though.
I can read it.
Okay.
You, holy God, have hallowed your people, Yisrael, and their Shabbos. You are the only God. You have chosen only our ancestors from among all peoples to serve you. And you have chosen the Shabbos alone for rest, for honor, and for blessing, for lighting candles, and for joy and delight in your service. Today is your Shabbos Kodesh, which we are obliged to maintain with great care as a Koshon cares for his Kalal. I repeat what our sages said when they called the Shabbos a Kalal. I have already lit the candles according to the requirements of your sages, who knows your holy,
Torah.
skip a line,
Torah.
and who know how to study it and hallow your name and your Torah. Almighty God, give me and my husband and all my children in my household this Shabbos Kodesh for rest, for holiness, and for blessedness. Protect us from all evil events which occur nowadays because of the unlucky conjunction of the planets. As I have lit the candles to honor the Shabbos, Lord of the whole universe, give me children who will shine in the light of the Torah. Send us a blessing with the good angel who walks at a person's right hand, and may the evil angel respond, Amen. May we merit that you cause us to inherit the day, which is holy Shabbos, which means may we live until the time of the resurrection of the dead. Praise be you, God who lives forever, ever. Amen.
Any reactions? Anything strike you as interesting or unusual or curious?
There's
Christine?
a certain amount of, with the business about the unlucky conjunctions of the planets.
Yeah, that's what I was.
It's, oh, I can't think what I want to say about it. Go ahead, you guys.
What about that?
Well, that's what I was wondering about. What's this astrology creeping in? It's so strange.
It's really strange to us, isn't it, when we see that? In one of the ancient synagogues, Bet Shean, I think it is, right, Rabbi Singer?
Think so.
Has in a mosaic of the what do you call that thing?
Astrological signs.
Yeah, well, the whole astrological chart, the circle with all of the different animals and months on it, is a mosaic of it on the floor of the synagogue. Astrology was not only known but used by Jews going all the way back to ancient Israel.
Wow.
And we don't see it for a number of reasons, which but it's always been kind of Jewish adjacent. And anything else about it that kind of surprises you? The astrology for sure.
Okay,
Anything else?
yes, I think it's very interesting that it says the intimation is that when the Messiah comes, he will raise everyone up. Very similar to the Christian concept that when Jesus comes back, he's going to raise the dead. I think the concept was stolen. Well, it's not stolen, but the concept was there in Judaism and it went over to Christianity, which I think is fascinating.
It's very interesting. And there is this this prayer for redemption and this kind of messianic hope in here. I don't know if it surprises you. And also just a suggestion that I think Christianity and Judaism both got them from the Greeks with their story of Persephone, right? And Greek, ancient Greek myths around redemption and raising of the dead and that sort of thing. But yeah, we see this overlapping, this cultural overlapping and mixing of ideas.
I don't think it's surprising that they have astrological concepts because there's still people today that have astrological. It's in the paper every day, and it's not Christians or Buddhists that read it. I'm sure a lot of Jews read it too.
Absolutely. The zodiac is what I was talking about. There is a mosaic of the zodiac, one of the ancient temples in Israel outside of Jerusalem called Bet Shean. But we don't expect it in our prayer. But this was prayer written not for the scholars. This was prayer written for a very different kind of stratum of the community. So, Christine, one more. I see.
Just a question quickly.
I don't want to test everybody's endurance here. So,
Oh, yeah, well, okay. I found it curious that she talks about the angel on the right hand and the bad angel on the left hand, and that seems odd to me also.
you know the song Shalom Aleichem that we sing as part of our Kabbalat Shabbat? In going back into ancient Jewish times, in the legends of the Jews, there is this legend that on Shabbos, we get an extra soul, a neshama yetera, and that when we're lighting candles, there are two angels who accompany us. And there's a reference to those angels in our song, Shalom Aleichem.
Oh,
The
that's what
angels-
that is.
And if you light your candles in time for Shabbos, so there is a legend going back to the Middle Ages and probably way further than that, that when the husband is returning from shul after evening prayers and the house is bright and the wife has lit her Shabbos candles, there is an angel on each of his shoulders, and when he comes to a house that's warm and light, the evil angel has to amen the prayer. And if the house is dark and cold, then the good angel has to amen the prayer, and that sets the tone for his whole week. It's sexist and it's all kinds of offensive, but it's one of our old legends about the angels that sit on our shoulders for Shabbos. And this is what she's talking about here.
Thank you.
Any other responses to this? Can we do another one?
Yes.
Okay. So this one was written for a woman who is about to immerse in the mikvah. Do I have a reader? Do I have a new volunteer, someone who hasn't read yet, or Joan? I think. You're muted, sweetheart. And this says, Tachana Eder Afroi Gate in Tfilat Mitzvah. So it's a supplication before a woman goes to immerse herself and do the mitzvah of immersion.
Okay.
Mhm.
Great God, through water you have performed great miracles many times. Noach Hasadek was saved from the flood. Moshe Rabbeinu was pulled out of the water. Miriam's well accompanied the Jews in the desert. May you also perform your miracle today so that I may be helped through the water to bear a son who will be completely righteous, who will study Torah day and night, and who will light a path for me directly to Gan Eden after I have lived a long life. May I, through his merit, deserve to sit in the Mechitza together with the matriarchs in the world to come. Amen.
Does everyone know what a mechitza is?
Yes, I'm afraid so.
No. Okay. So for those of you who don't know, in traditional synagogues to this day, and certainly during the Middle Ages and later, women and men didn't sit together, and their spaces were divided by a curtain or a wall or some barrier, so they could not even see each other. And that barrier is called a mechitza. And she is here praying that may, through her son's merit after a long life, she will deserve to sit in the mechitza, in the women's section, with our matriarchs. Because even Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah have to sit in the mechitza in Gan Eden, in the world to come. So, any other responses to this one?
Miriam's well,
Mhm.
that's a really very interesting addition to going to the mikveh.
Mhm.
It's interesting that they put that into the Kahina that long ago. That's really nice.
Right? The times in Torah when we see miracles associated with water. So Noah and the flood, Moses pulled from the Nile River by Pharaoh's daughter, and Miriam's well, which is a lovely image.
Yes.
I sort of noted the part about may I through his merit deserve to sit together. That part sort of got me.
How did it get you?
It's not her own merit.
No.
You know it. So guess that reflects the attitude then.
I imagine it does. That a woman's merit comes through her sons
Mhm.
and her husband, the men in her life. We live in a very different world.
Is she saying that after the mikveh, she's hoping she'll become pregnant with a son after she purifies herself that way?
Yes.
Yes,
Mhm.
yes, it sounds that way.
Mhm.
So these are some of the rules around female purity. And not that I'm very well versed at them at all, but when you look at them from a little bit of perspective, you see that these rules about Shomer Negiah of not touching one another and only touching one another during certain times and only after the mikvah, and how the time for going to the mikvah is calculated, all of it seems to try to maximize fertility and conception. So the point of going to the mikvah was to be able to resume relations with your husband. And the only reason to have relations is to get pregnant. And if you're going to get pregnant, she's saying she really wants a boy.
Yeah.
I find it interesting that she talks about the world to come. Does she mean that when the Messiah comes, or does she mean heaven? I'm wondering what she means.
It could be any of those.
I think she means after she dies. That she will have a son who will give her
Right, yeah, right. But the world to come, does she mean a heaven, or does she mean,
heaven. Yes, that's
does
what
she
I think.
mean, or does she mean reborn? I mean, it's kind of Christian. It's interesting.
No, I think she means after she dies.
Right, after she dies, but does she mean heaven, or does she mean the Messianic age, or the Messiah, or it has various meanings, I think.
Rabbi
I'm
Singer,
just
a
saying.
whole section on the afterlife in Jewish tradition.
Yeah, unfortunately, the afterlife is very unclear in our tradition. It could be when the Messiah comes. It could be after the Messiah comes. It could be heaven. It could, yeah. There are a lot. Two Jews, three opinions. There are lots of different opinions about it.
Right, right,
I thought
yes.
I would sound a little snippy if I said all of the above, Sherry. So I kind of let the group sort of take it. The Jewish tradition, our texts are just not specific about what happens after we die. There's certainly plenty of superstition and legendary material about it. And these messianic impulses that someday Messiah will come and gather us all together. Well, that's intended, I think, essentially in historical time, right? Put a new king on the throne of David in Jerusalem, and all the Jews will once again go back to live in Jerusalem. But there are writings about what happens at the end of time. Our texts tell us, don't look before the bet, meaning what? Bet's the first letter in the Torah. Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. Don't look before time started, and we don't really talk much about after time, right? But we do mention this olam haba in the Yiddish, and in fact, I had trouble when I was reading this to myself in Yiddish, because I've spent so much time learning to read and understand Hebrew for text study that when there is a Hebrew word in the Yiddish, I wind up pronouncing it with a Hebrew accent instead of a Yiddish accent. And it says, and she says here, ich soll durch sein Schut. Schut has a Yiddish pronunciation, but I only know the Hebrew one. Through his merit, zoche sein, meritorious shall I be, zu sitzen mit die Imahot, to sit with the matriarchs in ein mechitze be'olam haba amen. May I sit in the world to come. And there's a lot of talk about the world to come, but nobody really tells us what it is.
So, Annette, it's 7:29. And so do you mind stopping to share the screen? And then we can
I don't mind at all.
see everybody. There you are. Okay.
So we didn't get to all the texts. We didn't get to the stories of Rabbi Levi and Berdichev. They are in the handouts that you were emailed by Rabbi Singer. And
Carol Lee, do you have one more quick?
I just have to say, I think those techinas are wonderful. It's
Right.
like a doorposts on your house. It was how to do things at home, whereas prayer books are for prayer, are for going to a temple or to study. I think they're wonderful. I had no idea that our ancestors did that. I'm so amazed, really.
Thank you, Carol Lee.
so
So
just a plug for next week, folks, before I let Rabbi Singer wrap up for us, is that we won't be doing so much history, and there'll be more time to look at texts and to listen to some multimedia kinds of things and have different kinds of experiences. And thank you for sticking through all of this with me. I really enjoyed your presence and your participation.
It was wonderful.
yes,
Yes, it was. And the history is really interesting.
I
Yes.
love the history.
Very
Right
interesting.
group.
I want to thank you as well for a really interesting session that really sets the stage for our next two sessions. I think it's important to have that history and geography set for us so that we understand the material you're giving us. And I think everyone really enjoyed it. So thank you so very much. I did send out the material. If anybody didn't get it, I can send it again. I just sent it another time earlier today, but please let me know.
What's on the side?
And so we look forward to next Thursday, same time, same place.
Yes,
And thank you everyone for joining us.
thank you all so much.
Thank
So
you.
next
you
week,
so much.
it will be poetry, stories, and songs. There'll be some music, there'll be some poems, there'll be some short stories.
Sounds good.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sounds wonderful. Thank you.
Very good, thank you.